Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Following the United States' decision last month to end sanctions exemptions for major exporters of Iranian oil, President Trump slapped new sanctions on Iran's metal exports on May 8. Metal exports are Tehran's largest non-petroleum related source of export revenue and constitutes about 10% of its export revenues. Last September, EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini and Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarifi had announced that the European Union would pursue a trade mechanism known then as the Special Purpose Vehicle to bypass sanctions imposed by the United States following its May 2018 withdrawal from the nuclear deal. Originally described as a tool for preserving legitimate trade with Iran, including oil sales, the mechanism now known as the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, or INSTEX, will initially be limited to trade exempt from US sanctions. INSTEX will operate like a barter system to coordinate payments for imports and exports, bypassing US sanctions targeting Iranian banks and financial messaging services. In a January 31 statement announcing INSTEX, the French, German, and UK foreign ministers said the mechanism would focus initially on the sectors most essential to the Iranian population, such as pharmaceutical and agricultural goods and medical services. The US has dismissed and condemned INSTEX at a February International Ministerial Summit on the Middle East in Warsaw, hosted by the United States and Poland. US Vice President Mike Pence called INSTEX an effort to break US sanctions against Iran and an ill-advised step that will only strengthen Iran, weaken the EU, and create still more distance between Europe and the United States. He called on Europe to stop undermining US sanctions on Iran and to join the United States as we bring the economic and diplomatic pressure necessary to give the Iranian people, the region, and the world the peace, security, and freedom they deserve. Iran welcomed INSTEX but called it a step too late. Tehran also said that it hadn't seen any tangible results which could preserve the nuclear deal. Since the establishment of INSTEX, the US has already ratcheted up the sanctions pressure, and the EU barter mechanism doesn't deal with Iran's oil sales, the major squeeze on Iran's export revenues. The US has already asked its European partners and the EU to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Meanwhile, hours earlier on Wednesday, President Rouhani said that Iran would resume enrichment of uranium in 60 days beyond the low fissile purity, which is suitable for civilian nuclear power generation allowed under the deal, unless the 5 other powers signed up to it found a way to protect Iran's oil and banking industries from US sanctions. That is unlikely to happen. Tensions are high, and the US has announced it is deploying a carrier strike group and bombers to the Middle East in response to what it said were troubling indications and warnings from Iran. To discuss the situation, we have with us Meguerditchian, who is a journalist and political commentator based in Paris. We also have Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm from Iran, and Lucy Taylor, who's the Indus correspondent based in Moscow. If I may begin with you, Lucy, how is Moscow going to react to this? And I ask this because Iran is relying, in fact, more than the EU and France, Germany, and Britain on essentially Beijing and Moscow. But the relations between Moscow and Tehran are not really very good, especially in the Syrian context, where we've been seeing reports of disagreements over how, once the civil war ends, what kind of dispensation will there be next? So how is Moscow going to react to this?
Well, Moscow has thrown its weight behind this deal, and I think it's significant that the Iranian foreign minister was here in Moscow on the day that this new announcement from Tehran came through.
Right.
The foreign minister met the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. They gave a joint press conference speaking about the next steps in this. So I think although, however the relationship is in other contexts, these two countries are very keen to present an image of solidarity. Russia has said it will continue to uphold its commitments under this deal, and further than that, it's urged the other parties, particularly in Europe, to do more to try to safeguard this deal as well. Sergei Lavrov said that this deal was a very complex structure. It didn't just take 1 month to draw up, he said. It took many months to draw up. It was very complex and balanced structure. And as such, the United States withdrawal has left the deal very fragile. That's what he said. And he urged Europe in particular to do more to allow Iran to export its oil. As he said, he wanted Europe to do more to fulfill its obligations under this deal. So Russia very much by the side of Iran on this, trying to uphold this deal. And Iran, in turn, has thanked Russia and said that Russia and China are the ones doing most to uphold the deal at the moment. So whatever this relationship may be in other contexts, definitely trying to present an image of solidarity.
Absolutely. That was the crux of the press conference that you were talking about. But here's the essential issue. How is Russia actually going to help Iran? Because, as I said, the Instex also does not really address the main sources of revenue. That's the main squeeze on Iran, whether it's about the oil sales or now the metals, which are the second largest source of export revenue for Iran. So what substantive measures do you think Moscow is going to take in trying to sort of, help Iran?
Well, I think perhaps that's the crux of this issue, is that Russia on its own can't do very much. It doesn't have any particular power to influence Europe or the United States. I think from what they've said so far, it's mostly relying on diplomacy. Lavrov was asked whether he believed that there should be further meetings between all the partners of this deal to try to work out a way forward. He said that consultations were definitely required, perhaps not at the ministerial level, but at a lower level to try to work out a way forward. I think Russia offers Iran a voice. It's another country arguing the case for upholding this deal, but whether that translates into any practical measures, anything that Russia can tangibly do that it isn't at the moment, it's difficult really to say. And I think Iran and Russia really need probably China as well and Europe to come on board and really back this in order to have any sway on what happens at all. At the moment, Russia is blaming the United States, calling it irresponsible behavior to withdraw from this deal, saying that it's been warning of the consequences of the US withdrawal for a year now, and now they're starting to happen. But ultimately, as you say, those aren't practical steps. This is a voice in the world that Russia can offer, but probably not much more than that.
Okay, so me, the press conference and essentially what Moscow said, or Sergei Lavrov said, speaking obviously on behalf of Moscow, was more about essentially presenting Moscow, as they've been trying to do, as a counterweight to the US at various fora. For instance, the recent meeting with Kim was also one such step that Moscow took. But in reality, Moscow cannot do very much to essentially circumvent the sanctions against Iran. Moscow, it also is very clear, is actually enjoying the high oil prices, frankly, which are a result partially of the lesser oil sales from Iran. But taking advantage of your presence on the program, let me just go back to the reference to Syria. Increasing reports about once hidden Russian-Iranian disagreements, both in terms of the conduct of war itself and also once this brutal war comes to an end. In fact, there's also a very damning report by some of the pro-Tehran militias operating in Syria talking about the Russians actually providing coordinates to the Israelis for aerial and air attacks on these militias. So I think things are not really that good as far as Russian and Iranian relations in Syria are concerned.
Well, I think what the Russian authorities would say, what the Russian leadership would say, is that the relations are as good as they could be between Russia and Iran at the moment. Sergei Lavrov stressed yesterday that the two presidents of Russia and Iran have met 4 times in the last year, so more than other relationships around the world, perhaps. They're coordinating on Syria as part of the Astana format talks. We're expecting further meetings to be announced very shortly on that. But yeah, Russia is in a way playing a delicate balance between all the different powers in the region. Russia wants to be seen as a mediator in Syria, the key ally of President Assad in Syria. It wants to be seen as somebody who has a relationship with all the parties in the region, including Israel and Iran, including Palestine, including Turkey, all of the various players in the region, and then particularly in Syria. But it is a delicate balance, particularly between Iran and Israel, as you say. So that is something that Russia is trying to juggle at the moment, and certainly outwardly very much displaying solidarity with Iran, talking about the ways that they're working together. This meeting that was had yesterday was not just about this nuclear deal, although that was one of the main focuses, but they also discussed other areas where they're in agreement, not just Syria, but Venezuela and other international issues as well. So at least there's a dialogue happening, there's an outward display of a good relationship between the two. As you say, the actual reality of that relationship is likely to be more complicated, not least because of the role that Russia is trying to play in this region.
Absolutely. As Sergei Lavrov, deputy, said in an interview to a US television channel, that this is not an alliance, this is something short of an alliance, and this is more about cooperation between Russia and Iran. Thank you, Lucy Taylor, for giving us your perspective from Moscow. Van, there was a controversy over comments by France's ambassador to the US when he tweeted saying it's false to say that at the expiration of the JCPOA, Iran will be allowed to enrich uranium. And he added that sanctions could be reimposed, and obviously Tehran protested, and then the ambassador took down those comments from his Twitter handle. So how is France looking at these new sanctions, and how much do you think is this Instex going to be effective in terms of providing some kind of relief to Iran?
Hello, Ejaz. Thanks for having me. To begin with, when it comes to Instex, when it comes to this special purpose vehicle that the French, the Germans, the British have been trying to put in place and try to have this talk, to have some kind of a special relationship and to continue trade with Iran, to help the Iranians evade the sanctions imposed by the Americans after their withdrawal in 2018. The problem with this Instex is that there's so little we know about it. We don't know a lot about Instex. We don't know a lot about the Financial Action Task Force that is based in Paris, that is supposed to help the Europeans do some kind of deals with the Iranians. And the proof of this is that the Iranians themselves are saying this is not enough for us. As you rightly reminded your viewers a while ago, the Iranians, with this week's action, basically are saying that the economic situation in Iran is much worse than you can imagine back in Europe. Yeah. And the Instex and your this fantasy about that you can actually have a barter-based trade with us is going to help us, or is going to save us from a regime collapse, or the country's heading to a humanitarian crisis at some point if this inflation continues this way. So their decision this week pretty much proves that Instex is not an effective tool. And it also proves what Mike Pence, the US Vice President, said to the Europeans, and you rightly also mentioned a while ago. Mike Pence couldn't have put it in a better way. Mike Pence said, basically, Europeans, if you're going to go on a road of proposing some types of deals with Iran to evade the American sanctions, you're basically giving Iran the tool to put a wedge between the Americans and the Europeans. And this is what is happening, actually. We should not forget the reason France, Germany, the European Union, especially France, has been committed to JCPOA, regardless of American opposition to it in the past 2 years, is that the French president kept on saying that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, repeatedly said that Iranians are complying with JCPOA, Iranians are complying with the deal, so there is no need for us to get out of this deal. It is in French interest, in European interest to stay in this deal, so is in Iranian interest. And what we have today is that the Iranians are basically saying, well, you know what, we're going to stop abiding by that deal. And in a month or two, if IAEA comes out with a report that says actually the Iranians are not fully complying now, that gives the French another reason to get closer to the American position.
Absolutely. And you're right. In fact, if I might, the IAEA Director General, Yukiya Amano, has warned against pressing the international nuclear watchdog. And this was back in Jan 30. He said that if attempts are made to micromanage or put pressure on the agency in nuclear verification, that is counterproductive and extremely harmful. He also said that independent, impartial, and factual safeguards implementation is essential to maintain that credibility. But here's the problem, Van. I think the Trump administration has made it very clear that it's not just about the JCPOA. Well, they've said that this is a bad deal. Trump said this on the campaign trail also. He wasn't particularly enamored of this deal, which obviously the Obama administration struck. But they have since made it clear that the key foreign policy goal of the current US government is to initiate regime change in Iran by crippling its economy to such a degree that popular unrest removes the current power structures. And they're also concerned about, of course, the missilery that Iran has been developing and continues to develop. But more than that, also Iran's power projection or realpolitik in the greater Middle East. So it's a larger issue for the Trump administration and not just the JCPOA.
Yes, of course it is. Just as in France, the government is divided between hawks and moderates who like to pursue diplomacy in the French government. The U.S. administration, the Trump administration, is clearly divided on that as well. You have, on one hand, you have the National Security Council dominated by the likes of John Bolton, who is the national security advisor to the president, who has a very tough stance and who would like to see a regime change in Venezuela, who would like to see a regime change in Iran, and then you have the president's camp, especially the president himself, who does not think on issues in a political manner as much as he thinks on economic terms. The president of the United States thinks on economic terms, while his advisors in the NSC think in political terms. The NSC advisors do not understand that countries like Iran and Venezuela, regardless of economic pressure, regardless of collapse of their countries' economies, they are not developed countries that would topple governments because of an inflation. These are countries where you can kill at least 50 or 100 people in one day, and nothing would change in the country. The human rights situation is so terrible that economic problems wouldn't shake a government, wouldn't shake a regime. So the American government's division on this, that Trump's approach from the beginning, Trump throughout his campaign and afterwards, his concern with the JCPOA was that the Americans were not getting a lot of money from this, that the Iranians are getting a lot of money, the Americans are not getting a lot of money from this. So what the president's approach was on economic terms, to have the Gulf states, the Arab states, contribute more money in Iraq, contribute more money in the Middle East, contribute more oil into the world oil market. This is what the president thinks about. This is the president of the United States is thinking about the global economy, the U.S. economy, before the global economy, of course. But so he's thinking about money, and then by increasing pressure.
Ben, I think it's more than just. I mean, I take your point. We've seen like the trade wars and the rest of it, and asking NATO member countries to spend more, and the rest of it. He's obviously someone who thinks about the pockets and the purse. But I think there's more to this Iran thing than just that. But stay with me. I am going to pull in Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm from Tehran. Mustafa Khoshcheshm, what do you think of this new pressure? Because what we've seen from statements, regardless of the fact that the Iranian ultimatum about we will sort of start pulling back from JCPOA in the next 60 days if the other treaty partners do not circumvent the US sanctions. But the fact is that Iran is in a tough spot. So how exactly would Iran be dealing with these new pressures?
Hello, thanks for having me. Well, there's a lot to say. At the beginning, I need to say that before answering your question, that I totally disagree with your understanding of Iran-Russia ties. Actually, I was a little bit surprised of such a one-sided interpretation of the relations between the two. It's more.
I was only referring to some of the reports. That's all. I was just referring to some of the reports.
I know. Let me present you a little bit with facts. These are the output of Western media and Israeli media outlets that are trying to misuse their good relations with Russia in order to sow discord between Iran and Russia. Remember that the Russians were taken by Iran after a 2-hour-long, only a 2-hour-long meeting between Iranian IRGC Quds Force Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani and Putin himself. After 2 hours of talking, he could persuade Putin to join Iran and Syria in Syria to fight back the terrorists, and they did so. They have fought off all ISIL and Al-Qaeda terrorists. They have already started their offensive in Idlib in northwestern Syria, and they've done a lot. At the same time, Russia is in good terms with Israel. That's, agreed. Everyone knows that. But Russia, everyone agrees. Russia is a strategic ally of Bashar al-Assad. Iran is a strategic ally of Bashar al-Assad. So the two are connected to Bashar al-Assad, the guy, and they are cooperating with each other. There are some discrepant differences, but they should be interpreted in the larger context of their strategic cooperation in Syria. At the same time, I was surprised to hear from your correspondent that the Russians cannot do anything or are unable to do anything to bypass the sanctions for Iran. Actually, it's no secret, but not very much known fact that the Russians have been helping Iran all throughout the last 15 years in 3 major areas. I'm not allowed to present you with the numbers, but I can tell you that the Russians have been cooperating with Iran to bypass the sanctions in areas of energy exports, access to foreign currency and dollar markets, as well as banking ties. Not allowed to, reveal any further details, but they are going to do the same, and they are already doing so. And they said that, the Russian foreign minister stressed that they are going to help Iran stand up to the U.S. sanctions. The Chinese have also been helping Iran a lot all throughout the last decade. So basically, this is the situation that we have today, and they know that if the United States, wins this confrontation against Iran, the next target would be Chinese, especially now that they are at a trade war with China. Now, back to your discussion. I understand that my colleague from France speaks of, the viewpoint of the European officials towards the nuclear deal. But, everyone who's fair would understand that the Europeans have only been taking very good, positive, and strong political stances in support of the JCPOA without any action, zilch, nothing in economic areas. Under the JCPOA, Iran has been in full compliance, according to the IAEA. My colleague endorsed that. In 14 reports, they have said that Iran has been in full compliance with all its undertakings in this regard. And the Europeans and Americans have done nothing, zilch, in economic areas. After the U.S. discarded the deal, Mogherini promised Iran in written, according to papers and documents, that they would cooperate with Iran in 10 various areas of economic cooperation, including oil exports, banking, Iran's access to non-dollar markets, and so many other issues. None has been done yet. Only one of the 10 has been Instex that has not started operation yet after a year. So Iranians have come up with the idea that, okay, there is now an equation established in here. We are in full compliance. Europeans are not doing anything. And this equation and relation would remain the same for the years to come if we do not change this equation, if we do not give them motivation to do something, because apparently Europeans are not ready to pay the cost for their endorsement of the nuclear deal as an independent state or global power. Because if they are independent and they are a global power, they need to show respect for their signatures, not in literary terms signature, but their endorsement of the deal, and they should keep their promises and provide Tehran with the merits. If they care for it, if they like the merits of this deal, including global and regional security and stability that comes from this deal, then they need to make the costs. If they are not, then they are subordinate to the U.S. As we can see right now, except for political support, that's right, in areas of economy, the Europeans have been one way or another. They have been in support of the U.S. Actions and sanctions against Tehran because none is working with Tehran in economic areas. So Iran has given them some motivation, some serious pulse, but minimum pulse within the JCPOA. Iran has not dropped out of the JCPOA. It has modified only 2 of its obligations that came under ban by the United States. Iran had no other way if it wanted to, keep its nuclear productions, enriched uranium and, heavy water productions. Yeah. It had no other way but to store them at home. Therefore, it has given them, 60 days in order to think if they care for this nuclear deal or not. If not, then Tehran would go on modifying more and more undertakings.
Absolutely. At this point, I'm going to take a short break, but Mustafa Khoshcheshm's explanation raises various other possibilities and questions that we shall take up after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the new U.S. sanctions against Iran, which are part of Wednesday's executive order, which targets Iranian iron, steel, aluminum, and copper sectors, and hopes that sanctions will deny the Iranian government the ability to provide funding and support, as the statement says, for the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorist groups, and networks, campaigns of regional aggression and military expansion. As you can see, the statement subsumes a number of things that are much more than the JCPOA, the acronym for the Iran nuclear deal, which is a multilateral agreement between Iran, the US, European Union, and France, Germany, Britain, China, and Russia. So, Van, quickly, before I let you go, as Mustafa Khoshcheshm was saying, the European treaty partners, agreement partners, have so far, to use his term, done zilch to address Iran's concerns. And he also says that they could have done this, and this was something that was given in writing to Iran, but did not happen. So, do you think that European Union can do that, and France, Germany, and Britain can do that without a serious rupture in relations with Washington?
I don't know, Ejaz, if it's mainly about this rupture between the relations between the US and the Europeans. It's more about this has become a lot more like a chain reaction. In April of this year, the Americans decided to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization globally.
Correct.
This came after months of deliberations, yes, but also this came at the same time when the Europeans, because of the American withdrawal from JCPOA, they were sympathizing with the deal, and they were saying, we're going to try to put in place a structure, Instex or what have you, another sort of a barter-based trade system to continue trading with Iran. Because you have to remember, there in France and in other countries in the European Union, it's not as similar as in the United States. There is a public opinion in favor of better deals with Iran. There is less of an appetite.
No, absolutely. Van, I agree with you. In fact, after the US withdrew from the deal last May, the European Union invoked the blocking statute that effectively bans European companies from following the US's sanctions on Iran. But the point really is that the European Union is not really going all the way. It's not saying that, look, Iran is complying with JCPOA and that this deal was about JCPOA. This was about Iranian nuclear advancement. It has nothing whatsoever to do with any other activity that Iran might be accused of. So therefore, the premise for the European Union is simply JCPOA, which is not the case as far as the Trump administration is concerned. But the European Union seems to go a step forward and then chooses to take 2 steps backwards. That's the problem here.
Yes, that is, yes, of course, that is the problem. That is the problem because the Europeans know it. Whether you say the JCPOA is separate from what Iranians the Iranian role in the Middle East is, nobody can separate those two. Everybody knows that Iranian role in the Middle East is tangled in many of the cases, in many of the details of what pushed for the JCPOA. The JCPOA fear, before JCPOA deal, there was fear that the Iranian enrichment would be an element in a further destabilization of the Middle East. More than that, so today the Europeans have taken a step, one step in a year. It took them a lot of time to get to Instex, but as Mustafa a while ago told you as well, and I agree with him, that the Europeans have not shown a lot, and that's the Iranian fear. The Iranian fear is that the Europeans are just full of talk and no action.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
in a way that is right, but they have to understand that the Iranians need the European Union more than the European Union needs Iran today. France, for instance, French government has been doing a lot of more deals, military deals with Saudi Arabia today because of the sanctions on Iran. So the Iranians should understand, the more they have sanctions on them, the less relevant they're becoming in the region. The French are taking more and more deals with other Arab Gulf countries today.
Well, that's a strange. I mean, I wouldn't call it a strange argument. I just say this is real peak. I'm sure, obviously. But thank you so much, Van, for your insights into this. Mustafa Khoshcheshm, here are the 2 scenarios. And one scenario is that nothing really happens in terms of as far as the Europeans are concerned. And, the pressure mounts on Tehran. And Tehran decides that it pulls back from the JCPOA. The other scenario could be that before it pulls back from JCPOA, it nips the essential problem, and that is the NPT itself, which has a withdrawal clause. And so Iran says everything that is being done to us is with reference to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore we are invoking this withdrawal clause. We're getting out of the NPT, and once we've gotten out of the NPT, JCPOA does not exist anymore, period. So I know these are worst case scenarios, but well, things could reach that point.
Well, let me give you the overall picture here. Either the European Union would take action in the next 2 months in order to improve the situation, or not. Apparently, they have issued a statement today saying that they would discuss it on Monday, but they would not regard this 2-month-long deadline from the side of Iran, and they are not intimidated. Okay, fine. If they take action in support of the deal, on the ground, then Iran would resume these two halted obligations as before. And I don't think that they are going to show any kind of harsh reaction towards Iran in the next 2 months for these two obligations that Iran halted, because they were already under a ban from the United States anyway. But after these 2 months, if they don't take any action, surely Iran would go modifying all its undertakings one by one until nothing but a shell would remain from the JCPOA. Therefore, the European Union would not tolerate that, and they would reimpose sanctions either after these 2 months or in a year from now. Now, the next move would be retreating from the NPT. Also, Iran has lots of instruments to respond. I can count for days. For example, Iran could increase the purity level of its uranium enrichment to 90%, 60% or 90%. Then in other areas, in addition to the nuclear area, Iran could do a lot. For example, Iran could declare a decision that it would increase the range of its ballistic missiles over 2,000 kilometers. Iran could start manufacturing ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in missile area. Iran has allies and friends in all the region that could make life harder, very harder, for the United States and its allies. Also, Iran could exercise strict checks and inspections in the Strait of Hormuz, especially against Saudi and UAE vessels, trade cargoes, and oil tankers.
That is why the U.S. is deploying a carrier strike group in the Gulf, precisely in response to what they say is Iranian provocation in the Strait of Hormuz.
There is a reason. There are two reasons that they've done so. Apparently, they've done that in order to intimidate Tehran. That would require separate, discussion. If we have time, I would explain about that. But another reason is avoiding or blocking any effort by Tehran to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That's the last resort option. Iran is not going to do that anytime soon. At least at the beginning, it would exercise strict checks and inspections. It would not shut it down, because if it shuts it down, then energy consumers, everyone would have some complaints, and the pressure would be distributed among everyone equally.
Okay.
But if it
so Mustafa, sorry to cut you short, but I also have to wrap up the program. So Iran is going to have a graduated response. I'll come back to you quickly before I end the program, but I'm also joined by Michael Arnold, who's an analyst at TRT World. Michael, quickly, what do you think of the new sanctions and the possible Iranian reaction? You were hearing Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm, who's talking about the kind of graduated response that Iran could mount to these sanctions. But my question to you is, do you think the Europeans would come through? I mean, the special purpose vehicle and trying to sort of circumvent the sanctions against Iran and helping Iran's economy, the banking sector, and oil sales and the rest of it?
I think at this point, the Europeans don't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of the ability to come through. I mean, they set up this index trading system. However, that is also dependent on the banking system for financing and moving cash flows, which itself, of course, is subject to American sanctions. So as much as the Europeans may want to come through on their end of the promises, I can't really see a way that they will honestly be able to do that, especially in the time frame that the Iranians are wanting.
Okay, so as far as the Trump administration is concerned, it's not just about the JCPOA. for the Europeans and for the Iranians, it's about compliance with JCPOA. And so far, as everyone has said, including the IAEA, that Iran is in full compliance of the agreement. But the Trump administration is pitching it at a much broader level, talking about Iranian realpolitik and power projection in the greater Middle East, and of course, what they say, Iranian support of terrorist groups, declaring IRGC as a terrorist organization and the rest of it. So their dealings with Iran seem to have the key goal is to somehow initiate regime change in Iran by crippling the Iranian economy. Would you agree with that suggestion?
Effectively, I think that's what it is. I mean, it's very clear from the Americans' action that it's not really or solely about nuclear proliferation. There is a wider regional redrawing that at least the Trump administration has sort of claimed that they want to do. Whether it's the deal of the century, they're ramping up agreements and arms agreements with the UAE and Saudi in particular. I mean, these are all interconnected, and the pressure on Iran, obviously, which is being done not just for American interests, but on behalf of their allies in the region as well. I think is part of a larger strategy to cripple the Iranian economy and to cripple Iran to the point that if there's not regime change, at least effectively there would be, because their behavior would completely change. So I think that's a very accurate description of what we're seeing.
Okay, so finally, Arnold, do you think the way in which the U.S. has changed the goalposts on not just a bilateral agreement but a multilateral agreement, do you think it will have negative consequences for such undertaking in the future, where there's a weaker party that's drawn into a multilateral agreement on the basis of a quid pro quo, and then one or the other agreement partners decide to change the goalposts? That does not bode very well for such future undertakings, don't you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the American withdrawal from the GCPOA is really demonstrative of I think ultimately what we're starting to see is the increased bankruptcy of claims to be upholding a rules-based international order. Many countries in the world would love to actually operate under this rules-based international order and are willing partners at the table. However, when you have the one power who essentially is underpinning that system, who is not playing by those rules, and not that really undermines it, and I think that doesn't bode well for any type of deal like this in the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. Back to Mustafa Khoshcheshm. Any last words, Mustafa, in terms of the impact on the Iranian economy would be concerned? I know you said that the Russians and the Chinese have been helping in one way or another, but obviously, that cannot entirely, be a substitute for the kind of economic boost that Iran was looking at, and which was precisely the reason for Iran to negotiate the JCPOA.
There is no denying that Iran is under pressure economically, especially Iranian people, but it's not going to kill us. We have tried it once before under President Obama, who once said all options are on the table. So many times he said that. But after the Vienna deal, the nuclear deal was struck, he was addressing a think tank, and he was asked why he never used that option, the military option. He said that option was never available. That shows a lot to Iran. So they may not intimidate Tehran. Tehran is much more powerful after 3-4 years now compared to 2015 and before that. With regard to economy, well, I believe we are having a very difficult year ahead, but we would be pressured, but we would not be, subdued to surrender. If we listen to President Trump, if we listen to, Mr. Bolton and others, they should have already been in Tehran. They promised to be in Tehran a few months ago. They imagined that they could encourage or provoke Iranian people to take to the streets, but they failed and failed and failed, and they will fail again. They have been doing this to us for 40 years, and they have never earned any result. But if they earn success, that would be an area of weakening Iranian economy, but not destroying it. But there are very tough and serious and vital repercussions if this happens. You know, each year, Iran has been stopping millions of refugees who intend to cross the border from Iran into Europe, and Iran has been blocking them. Also, Iran has been spending billions of dollars in order to fight international drug cartels who intend to transit their cargoes through Iran to Europe. And if Iran's economy grows weak, then it could not fight these two, you know, social phenomena.
I hear you. Absolutely. I hear you loud and clear. Thank you, Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm, for giving us insights into what Iran's options are, and also the fact that you said that Iran will not be subdued and that we will not be killed by these sanctions. This is all for today from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.